everyone. Welcome back to a great season. Looking forward to all the tournaments that are to come and all the great topics that are probably going to come out. I think it's really important to start off the season very strong, get back into the swing of things, and start with great momentum for your team to motivate everyone to work really hard throughout the season and achieve great success. And I think that when getting back into the swing of things, especially after a summer when you probably weren't practicing as much as during the regular school year, it's really good to get a refresher from something like Champion Briefs. In the brief, we have a bunch of really good arguments that have been written out by some of the best debaters from past years, really in-depth topic analysis, one of them written by me. I think that it would be a great way to get yourself back into the grind of debate and prepared for the rest of the season. As well as giving you an edge for sure on the topic for September and October. With that said, in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the topic itself. I'm going to talk about why I think it was chosen and why it matters right now, explain a little bit of the background information, and then afterwards we're going to get into the arguments that I think offer potential winning paths for both sides of the debate, the pro and the con. So without further ado, the topic this month, as I'm sure most of you know, is resolved: the United States should accede to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea without reservations. So I think the first thing that's important to ask is, what is UNCLOS, or the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea? UNCLOS is the law, is international law that governs the sea, that governs all the things that happen on water, which includes everything from fishing to drilling to trade to everything that you could possibly imagine happening on international waters. And basically, all relevant actors, all relevant international actors, have signed onto this treaty except for the United States. So it's worth asking why the United States has not signed on to this treaty. The United States was a big part of the drafting process. I think that even one of the times when people got together to write UNCLOS, it was in New York, in the United States. So why have we not signed on? And it's generally because of an unwillingness for the United States to participate in the laws of the international order. And given the recent turns of tide in politics, with a shift across the globe towards more isolationist policies and disregard for international order and liberalism, it makes sense that this topic is coming out at this time. Also, the alternative topic was the arms sales to Taiwan, another topic that has a lot to do with international relations and has a lot to do with the things that are currently being talked about in the United States presidential administration, right? So even if the United States were to join UNCLOS, it's important to ask yourself first and foremost whether or not we would follow it. So before we even get into the questions of what UNCLOS does, it's first and foremost important to ask ourselves whether or not the United States even has an interest to follow international law at all, right? So in order for any law system to work, there needs to be a certain level of deterrence. There needs to be some kind of leverage and enforcement mechanism that someone or some third party or another party can hold over an actor in order to hold them accountable to the laws themselves. And in a system of international law, there is no authority that has leverage over the actors in the system, right? In the United States, we follow laws because, the government can put us in jail. But on the international scale, there's no one who's going to put Donald Trump in jail necessarily if he doesn't follow the law. And if they were to put him in jail, they probably wouldn't want to do that because it would be bad for their country to do that, to be the one who put Donald Trump in jail, to try him, or to try the United States, right? And there's a bunch of reasons for this. So in the past, historically, there were a lot of pieces of evidence and a lot of analysis, a lot of scholars have talked about how the United States has just refused to follow international law when it has not been explicitly in our interest. And that's because we have leverage over every other country, because the United States is the most powerful country militarily. If you guys remember from the military spending topic a few years ago, we spend more than the next 20 countries combined, right? We by far have the most advanced technology. There's no one who can really challenge us in any way militarily. So any type of conflict that would come as a result of disregarding international law automatically doesn't matter for the United States. We can defend ourselves in any given conflict perfectly fine without any problems. But the second reason why we might not follow international law is that we have an economic superiority over every other country as well, right? Given that we are the economic hub of the entire world, and all of the international trade markets go through New York and Wall Street, it means that we have so much leverage over other countries. So if anyone does anything that we don't want, we can simply not trade with them. We could put a sanction on them. That's like what we've been doing with Russia, right? Clearly, there's a big incentive not to go against the word of the United States, which means that the United States essentially has carte blanche when it comes to its international relations and has no incentive to necessarily follow international law. Furthermore, given the current change of tides in the United States, it would be really interesting if the current administration were to be willing to follow international law, especially in light of the utter disregard that we've had towards international law. For example, the renegotiation of NATO or backing out of the climate accords in Paris, right? So it would make sense that given the current political climate, even if there were leverage that other countries would have over the United States, we probably still wouldn't follow international law, right? So all of this stuff is really important to consider because any team could possibly come up there and run arguments that don't necessarily have to do with the following of UNCLOS. And it's important to be able to defend yourself against these claims, giving very strong reasons for why the United States would follow UNCLOS if it were to ratify it, and why we do care about it, why it is in our interest to do so. That is an important thing to look into. So with that being said, I think we can start to talk about the actual topic itself, about UNCLOS, and what exactly UNCLOS does. So the first and foremost thing that UNCLOS does is it divides the sea into two separate parts it divides them into many parts, but two that are really worth considering. The first is the EEZ, or the Exclusive Economic Zone. The EEZ is the zone of the sea within 200 nautical miles of the shore of any given country, right? And this part of the sea is essentially considered to be the same under international governance as the territory of the state itself, as if we were to walk onto the land itself. And this means that the state who owns this EEZ has entire control over what goes on in there. No one can mine in this EEZ, no one can go in there, no one can do anything within this zone unless they have explicit permission from the state itself. This means that they can't take the natural resources, they can't trade in this area, they can't conduct military missions in this area unless the government of the country gives them permission to do so. The other part of the sea is outside of the EEZ, and that is where anyone can do whatever they want as long as it is within the regulations and the restrictions that UNCLOS has provided, right? So what are some of these regulations? And this is where the topic really basically boils down, right? So UNCLOS has regulations on things like, on everything you could possibly imagine might happen in the deep sea, from fishing to natural resources to pollution to minerals to drilling to trade to the types of boats that you have, right? Like specific examples of this are like certain fuels are off limits. You're not allowed to use them in the ocean. Or for example, when it comes to fishing, because overfishing is a really big issue for many countries, they have quotas in certain areas of the sea where you can only fish for so many fish on a given day or in a given year, right? And they do it on a case-by-case basis, or they do it over time, right? Let's say that a certain area has been fishing too much and they think that they need to restrict the amount of fishing that's going on there. They would do so. They could pass a law to do that, right? So these are just a few things that UNCLOS does. In the context of the United States, probably one of the most interesting and one of the most important parts of UNCLOS is the fact that it subjects the United States to possible lawsuits that could be brought to the tribunal for UNCLOS, right? So when the United States accedes to UNCLOS, it would essentially say that it would be willing to follow all the laws that UNCLOS provides. This means, and this answers the first question that I posed for why the United States would have an incentive to follow UNCLOS, is that another country could bring a lawsuit to this tribunal and then hold that as leverage over the United States, which would act as leverage for a few reasons. One, because they might be able to decrease the soft power of the United States, right? It makes the United States seem illegitimate and like an unworthy partner, and it would threaten our face on the international scene. All of these things make it very hard for the United States to escape a world in which they are prosecuted under UNCLOS and the tribunal. So what exactly could they prosecute the United States for? Well, there are some climate agreements that the United States simply would not be able to avoid, right? So like a lot of arguments that we've heard at camp and a lot of arguments that I can foresee happening in the future are those that pertain to regulations of pollution, immediately on the sea for coal plants, for example. And so what would happen is that countries like island nations might sue the United States because they have an incentive to do so, because they're about to be destroyed by the rising tides of pollution. And so it would make sense that they would have an incentive to sue the United States. Now, whether or not the United States follows this lawsuit, even if it gets sued, is another thing that's up for debate, because there are a lot of lawsuits that are pending on China right now, and China still hasn't really changed its actions at all, right? So given these huge superpowers, when they come into international law, again, it's unclear as to whether or not they're going to actually follow what happens, right? Another really important thing to consider when it comes to UNCLOS is the International Seabed Authority, right? So this is a really important part of UNCLOS, because it states that any drilling that happens outside of the EEZ requires that a certain percentage of the revenue is given to this authority, which can then be redistributed to landlocked and developing nations. And this system makes a lot of sense, because it's only by luck and by chance that countries that are within that are landlocked were there. It's just by luck, or it's just bad luck that they are there, as opposed to on the sea. So it shouldn't be that all of the water and all of the riches of the water that are outside of the EEZ should be only given to countries that have the ability to drill there, right? So it makes sense that they would then give some of that money back to these other nations. And I think the rule is that you have to pay 1% for the first 7 years and then a certain amount afterwards, right? It's given to these countries in the form of unconditional sums of money that they can use for whatever they want. Right. So when it comes to actually writing these arguments, and when you're considering for either side what you want to run, what you might figure out is that the links of every argument are relatively similar, because it all has to do with the following of the international law, and the question becomes whether or not it is good for the United States to follow international law. Right. So I think you can spin any of these things as either good or bad. So let's take the example of the lawsuits, right? So if the United States is sued for polluting too many carbon emissions, and then it goes through, and the United States stops all of its coal emissions immediately, this could be good. Intuitively, it might be good, because it means that you decrease air pollution. It means that which means that fewer people in the United States die. Something like many thousands of people die in the United States every single year from air pollution alone. Additionally, it has impacts for global warming, because it means that there's not as many chemicals in the air that are trapping the sunlight and keeping the earth warm, right? But on the other hand, you could argue that it's probably a bad thing to make this quick transition from coal to renewable energy, which would be the nearest alternative. Why is this the case? Because renewable energy costs a lot right now. And in the foreseeable future, we can see the price of renewable energy decreasing to the point where it intersects with the price of fossil fuels as the production costs decrease and as they have more and more production, so that they can make it on a mass scale and reduce the cost of producing any given part of the renewable energy, like solar panels, etc., wind turbines, etc. What does this mean? It means that when you make a quick transition, energy prices will skyrocket, because now the consumers have to overcome the cost of the higher input costs that the companies have to pay for higher energy. So it means that across the board, energy prices and production prices and everything is going to increase dramatically, pushing thousands of people into poverty. That can be very bad, especially given the fact that the prices are probably going to intersect at some point in the near future anyway, which means that the only unique thing from the lawsuits is that the prices will go up and push people into poverty, because the global warming impacts are probably going to manifest regardless, right? So as you can see, there's good room to argue on either side of the debate for whether or not suing the United States for pollution is good or bad. Let's take another example and examine why it might be a good argument for both the pro and the con. So let's take this royalties point, right? It might be intuitively good to give royalties to developing countries, right, and to landlocked nations. For example, they could use this money to develop their infrastructure, which would allow them to develop more economic growth and then provide more money to their people in the forms of jobs and employment opportunities, provide more mobility and allow their kids to go to school, build schools so that they can be able to get better jobs in the future and that maybe they can go to other countries and then send money back, right? So clearly it might be a good thing to give money to these countries, or maybe they could invest in welfare systems that otherwise go unfunded, right? On the other hand, you could easily just as much argue that royalties are a bad thing, right? Because they're unconditional, and because landlocked nations and developing nations tend to be quite corrupt, because they have so little money, it leads a lot of leaders to hoard as much money as they can because there's not as much that's going around in the system. This means that there's an incentive in order to pocket the money or to divert it towards projects that don't necessarily help people, which in the long run might do worse for people because it will only increase inequality, decrease the opportunities for employment for the lower class, and make it even harder to exit poverty, thus hurting these nations, right? So you could just as easily argue that. Furthermore, you could argue that it enables more civil wars, right? Because there's so much evidence that's out there, so many studies and so much literature that argues that giving aid to countries increases the chances of civil war because it provides more resources for people to fight over, right? You could also easily argue that providing money in the form of cash transfers to these nations would make it harder to develop new welfare programs, right? Because it would mean that countries would be unwilling to do anything else to help themselves if they think that the International Seabed Authority is going to come in and bail them out whenever they need it, because they have a constant stream of money coming from the United States where they're drilling outside of the EEZ, right? So it creates a sense of complacency whereby they reduce welfare programs and they reduce the incentive towards helping the people, right? So it's clear that there's two sides to every coin, right? And on this topic, it's especially important to think about how you could spin something into being a good thing or how you could spin something into being a bad thing. And the best teams are going to be those who take a one solid argument that everyone is running and then flesh it out and make it into the most important impact in the round that you can easily weigh. And I've already given a few examples of doing that, and you would require more research and thinking to do even more of that, right? So the first place you can start for this research is to go to Champions Briefs. Again, this is a great brief. It has a bunch of really good arguments that are already written there, with pre-written weighing and ways of understanding these arguments, right? But the thing about Champion Briefs as well is that even if you want to go above and beyond what's in the brief, it gives you a good starting point. It gives you something that you can work with and then develop further afterwards. So I look forward to seeing everyone at tournaments, and this is going to be a great topic. I think it's super interesting. Especially important given the current times that we're in. And, good luck, everyone.